Let's step quietly into the dim corridors of our magical, after-hours museum, where the exhibits have a habit of whispering their secrets if you listen closely enough. Tonight, we begin with a portrait gallery that's not just painted, but powdered, plucked, and drained of all color. Welcome to the truly odd world of medieval beauty ideals. And before we lose ourselves among the ghostly faces and eyebrow-free foreheads, take a second to tap that like button and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy these midnight history rambles. And since I'm a curator who's always curious, drop a comment below telling me your location and the time zone you're tuning in from. It's surprisingly fun to see who's wandering these echoing halls with me, whether you're in Oslo, Osaka, or Omaha. Now, I suggest you dim your lights, perhaps flick on a fan for that soft medieval hum, and settle in as we journey through a time when beauty meant never looking like you'd seen the sun, or, for that matter, a healthy salad. In the medieval world, a pale complexion wasn't a warning sign that you needed iron supplements or a nap. It was a social statement, a fashion badge, a sort of unspoken billboard saying, "I am far too important to ever get dirty or do anything resembling work." Back then, bronze skin did not mean you just returned from a yoga retreat in Santorini. It meant you probably owned a shovel, and worse, you actually used it. The paler your skin, the clearer it was that your biggest struggle was choosing between embroidery and harp practice. This wasn't about a gentle ivory glow either. The ideal was skin so luminous and washed out, it looked as if you'd made direct eye contact with a ghost, or, more likely, you were the ghost haunting your own castle. Of course, biology can be uncooperative. Most people have blood, and it does tend to show up now and then in the cheeks. So the nobility rolled up their velvet sleeves and reached for the medieval cosmetic bag. Noble women, and, on occasion, men, would dust their faces with white lead powder, achieving that coveted, just startled by a poltergeist effect, while simultaneously embarking on a slow, scenic route toward heavy metal poisoning. Beauty, as they say, is pain, and in this case, also a bit of chemistry class gone wrong. Some people soaked cloths in vinegar and pressed them to their faces, hoping to bleach away any hint of earthly vitality. Others whipped up concoctions of crushed pearls and egg whites, an approach that promised paler skin and the added bonus of making your cheeks feel like a breakfast that had gone cold on a stone kitchen table. For those who really wanted to showcase their delicate nobility, blue veins were painted onto the arms and chests to mimic translucence. Imagine standing in candlelight, your skin so pale that your veins look like fine blue threads beneath the surface, as if you might shatter if someone sneezed in your direction. Medieval poets and artists played their part, too, crafting verses about ladies as white as milk, pale as snow, or, in one case, the moon in winter, which is a poetic way of saying she might faint at the mere suggestion of a draft. But this obsession with pallor wasn't only about looking beautiful. It was shorthand for class, purity, and the enviable ability to never have a sunburn. If you had the resources to avoid manual labor entirely, you were considered both fortunate and, apparently, attractive. Beauty in the Middle Ages required more than good genetics. It required commitment. And by commitment, I mean a willingness to dabble in what can only be described as the medieval version of chemical warfare on yourself. The most dedicated among the noble class would cake their faces with lead-based powder, achieving a smooth, even, and utterly lifeless matte finish. Think of it as the original full-coverage foundation, except with the side of mild organ failure. The manufacturing process for this deadly powder was an alchemist's dream. Take some vinegar, add metal, let it corrode until a crust forms, then grind it into a fine white dust. Apply daily, and soon you'll look like a porcelain sculpture come to life, or eventually not. If your skin began to flake or blister, or bits started peeling away like old wallpaper, congratulations, you'd achieved peak medieval skincare. Some took things further by adding mercury-based rouge for a blush of color, or dusting chalk for a longer-lasting finish. Egg whites could be brushed on the face for a glazed, almost shellacked sheen. Basically, if it was found in a barn or a wizard's workshop, it probably ended up on someone's face in the name of elegance. Unsurprisingly, the side effects were as dramatic as the results. Chronic fatigue, skin ulcers, and slow poetic decline were not just risks. They were basically included in the beauty kit. The nobility, however, stuck with it. Faced with the choice between an early grave or being mistaken for a peasant, many opted for the slow fade out, one powdery brushstroke at a time. And let's not forget, this wasn't just a women's club. In the later Middle Ages and early Renaissance, men at court sometimes joined in, using their own powders and potions, because nothing says refined lineage. Like a face as pale as an overboiled turnip, and a wardrobe that smells only slightly better than your rivals. Now, if you think that was extreme, let's raise our gaze, quite literally, to the high and noble forehead. Of all the medieval beauty trends, this one is the most, well, eyebrow-raising, because it involved making sure you had as little eyebrow as possible. A tall, bare, smooth forehead wasn't just on trend. It was considered the epitome of elegance, intellect, and a kind of spiritual purity. The higher and vaster your forehead, the more you looked like someone who spent their days composing psalms by the window, not digging in the vegetable patch. Achieving this look involved a level of dedication that would make modern grooming routines look downright lazy. Eyebrows were plucked out entirely. Sometimes scalp hair was removed inch by inch, pushing the hairline further up. This was not a casual trim. This was a full-scale forehead expansion project. Medieval grooming guides advised using tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from ingredients like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all to showcase a forehead so broad you could project the night's menu onto it. The results were striking, to say the least. If you look at portraits from the period, you'll see serene expressions crowned by foreheads so grand you could host a small jousting match up there. Combined with pale, nearly translucent skin and soft, rounded facial features, this look became a visual shorthand for refined, almost otherworldly beauty. Fashion helped, too. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and those famous cone-shaped hennins all played their part in emphasizing the high forehead, or at least hiding the spot where the eyebrows once dared to grow. This wasn't just a quirky trend confined to one kingdom. From the courts of England to France and Italy, noble women leaned into the high forehead craze, while artists and poets doubled down by praising those whose faces seemed to begin somewhere near the top of their skulls. And for those lacking time, tools, or the courage to pluck themselves into perfection, a bit of medieval improvisation came to the rescue. Some simply faked it by drawing their new hairline higher, or covering any renegade hairs with strategically placed headbands or veils. Yes, the Middle Ages had their own brand of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric and a lot less concealer. Eyebrows themselves weren't merely ignored, they were actively erased. In the 14th and 15th centuries, while today's beauty influencers might spend hours perfecting bold arches or feathered brows, medieval trendsetters saw eyebrows as nothing but facial weeds to be uprooted. To reach the ideal, women plucked their brows into oblivion or shaved them away, ensuring nothing would interrupt the glorious sweep of their forehead. The commitment level was so high, modern beauty gurus would probably need a moment to recover, especially since, for most, there was no handy brow pencil to fill anything back in. The process could get a little hazardous. Tweezers were the most benign method, but for the truly dedicated wax pumice stones, or concoctions of quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic were employed. Yes, arsenic, because nothing says, "I care about my looks," like risking a mild facial meltdown for the sake of a higher brow line. This was no fleeting fashion moment either. Illuminated manuscripts and painted portraits from the era confirmed the trend. Noble women with glassy, vacant expressions and foreheads, so broad they look quietly surprised all the time. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely universal. In some corners of Europe, especially where Byzantine and Middle Eastern influences trickled in, thin or delicately arched brows did persist. But for the majority of medieval Europe, the message was clear. If you could see your eyebrows, you were doing it all wrong. And while men were less likely to go full browless, the occasional courtier might trim or neaten his brows as a mark of refinement. Though, in all fairness, full removal was usually reserved for those who lost them in a particularly intense theological spat. What all this tells us is that medieval beauty had nothing to do with looking natural. It was about looking like you'd been hand-carved by a very particular angel, one who had some strong opinions about skin tone and forehead acreage. Angels in medieval art, after all, are rarely depicted with brows. Coincidence? Maybe, but it certainly didn't hurt their reputation for otherworldly perfection. So, as we step out of this gallery of pallor, plucked brows, and endlessly ambitious foreheads, take a moment to appreciate just how much effort and risk went into the medieval pursuit of beauty. Next time you reach for your sunscreen or brow gel, remember, it could always be weirder, and historically it often was. Up next, we'll head into the rosy world of medieval blush, blonde ambitions, and the secret life of hair. Because in the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was desirable. Let's see how they managed that, sometimes with results that were as questionable as their choices in forehead real estate. Let's pause before this next shimmering gallery case, a medieval vanity, lined with battered wooden combs, scraps of linen, and a few suspiciously crimson stains. Here, the story of blush begins, and, as always, medieval beauty is a labyrinth of rules, social traps, and a lingering whiff of purgatory. The ideal complexion wasn't the bronze glow of modern influences, but a gentle, bashful flush, as though you had just been told a risque tale by a wandering minstrel, or felt a cool wind on your face for the briefest moment. Too much sun was a cardinal sin, unless you were hoping to appear as if you'd spent the summer haymaking, which was not the goal for anyone with social ambition. A delicate rose tint on the cheeks was a silent announcement. I am young, likely healthy, possibly fertile, and I have, against all odds, survived to see another birthday. Yet, medieval etiquette demanded that you must never appear to be trying. The concept of woke up like this predates Instagram by about 800 years. Applying rouge was a dicey business. Vanity, after all, was only a few shades away from sin, and the local priest was always lurking nearby, ready to remind you of the perils of self-adornment. The church frowned deeply at painted faces, unless, of course, those faces belonged to the nobility, or were adorned in a spirit of humility, which was about as clear as a foggy dawn over the Thames. Still, where there's a will, there's a secret stash of beetroot juice. Medieval women improvised their blush from whatever was at hand: beetroot for a soft glow, crushed strawberries or mulberries for a deeper hue, and for those craving a real commitment to beauty, cochineal pigment harvested from crushed insects. Yes, bugs. Because nothing says, I'm ready for the harvest festival, like insect-based cosmetics. Some women simply pinched or rubbed their cheeks, hoping to achieve the perfect just run up the castle stairs effect. Others blended red ochre, or the sediment left at the bottom of a wine jug, dabbing it on with gentle discretion, all while praying their neighbours wouldn't catch them mid-makeover and report them to the clergy. For the upper crust, beauty came at a price, sometimes their own health. Wealthy women didn't settle for berry stains. They reached for rouge made from red lead or cinnabar, both toxic enough to make your modern dermatologist faint. But the thinking was, if I must perish early, let it be with the prettiest cheeks in town. Application was an art form in itself. Tools ranged from bits of cloth to nimble fingers, to whatever wasn't already in use stirring the family stew. Mirrors were rare and precious, so muscle memory and the occasional brutally honest maid were the beauty gurus of the day. The risk, of course, was overdoing it. Too much blush, and you might be mistaken for a woman of questionable repute, or worse, a French courtier. In that hierarchy of scandal, French women were always the gold standard for eyebrow-raising behavior. The trick was to enhance, never to announce. If someone praised your radiant glow, you were expected to murmur something about the brisk wind or a recent bout of prayer. Even the nuns got in on the action, dabbing a secret touch of beetroot on feast days, because nothing says devotion like a subtle flush peeking from beneath a wimple. Now, as we drift down this shadowy corridor, you'll notice another relic, a golden braid displayed atop a velvet pillow, glinting under candlelight. In medieval Europe, having hair that even remotely resembled spun sunlight, blonde hair, was the ultimate jackpot. Blonde signified youth, beauty, and, most crucially, a whiff of the divine. Artists, ever the dreamers, painted the Virgin Mary as a blonde, regardless of historical or geographical likelihood. Symbolism always trumped reality when celestial radiance was at stake. If you were born blonde, congratulations, you had won the genetic lottery and probably escaped some of the less glamorous household chores. But as anyone who has ever tried to keep up with fashion knows, nature is fickle. Blonde hair darkened with age, and so medieval women turned to the alchemist's kitchen. Their potions for lightening hair were as inventive as they were questionable. Saffron, chamomile, wood ash, honey, and lye all found their way into bubbling cauldrons. The resulting mixture was then liberally applied, and the hopeful beauty would sit beneath the sun, baking herself in a method charmingly known as sunbasking. The process required the patience of a saint and the skin resilience of a salamander. Some recipes called for a dash of urine. Whose urine, you ask? That part was left to the imagination. But as long as your hair shimmered like an angel's, the source was considered a minor detail. Beauty, it seems, has always included a healthy dose of the grotesque. But it wasn't just color that mattered. The ideal hair was long, loose, and gently wavy. Think pre-Raphaelite daydream, cascading in luminous waves down your back. But don't get too attached to those flowing locks. This was a privilege strictly reserved for the unmarried. The moment you exchanged vows, possibly accompanied by a dowry and a polite round of applause, your hair's days in the sun were over. Married women were expected to stow their golden tresses out of sight, stashed beneath layers of veils, nets, and head coverings. It was almost as if, by saying, "I do," your hair transformed into a medieval state secret. For noble women, hairstyles could become elaborate architectural works. Braids twisted and pinned, adorned with silk ribbons, beads, or delicate embroidery, all designed to signal that you most certainly did not shear your own sheep. Men, in case you were wondering, were not entirely left out of the follicular festivities. While less policed, a man with thick golden hair was the stuff of troubadour ballads and illuminated manuscripts. Knights charging into battle with flowing locks were the medieval answer to today's shampoo commercial, slow-motion toss and all. Hair, in short, was a currency. If you had it, you didn't necessarily flaunt it, unless, of course, you were in the matrimonial market. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose, a symbol of innocence and purity, but not so loose as to suggest you were auditioning for the role of ethereal woodland sprite. Unless you were actually a saint, or being martyred, in which case, let it fly. For everyone else, a modest braid was the safest bet. But once wed, your hair was consigned to the linen vault. Enter the era's answer to modesty, veils, wimples, nets, and the ever-practical coif. Imagine a medieval starter pack for the newly married. layers of beige linen, designed to turn even the most golden-haired beauty into a well-bundled mystery. These coverings weren't just about virtue. They were the Swiss Army knife of medieval fashion, protecting hair from smoke, lice, and the sort of compliments best left unsaid by wandering troubadours. The truly dedicated layered their coverings with the precision of a pastry chef. A close-fitting coif tucked under a wispy veil, which might be pinned beneath a wimple wrapping snugly under the chin. The net result? You resembled a pious, slightly overstuffed sandwich, and that was the point. Naturally, fashion could never resist an upgrade. As time passed, headwear evolved into feats of textile engineering. Hairnets embroidered with gold thread, veils starched into sharp angles, silken cages for braids, and even tiny bells for the woman who wanted to announce her arrival with every turn of her head. Subtlety, medieval style. Beneath these layers, a silent contest brewed. Who could conceal the most, yet hint at hidden splendor with a strategically placed jewel or a glimmer of golden hair peeking out. In the medieval mind, covered hair was a badge of morality. A veiled head signaled modesty and virtue. But should a married woman allow even a single curl to escape, comparisons to ladies of the night, or, most damningly, French women, were sure to follow. Yet, not everyone played by the book. Some women became masters of the loophole, letting a carefully styled lock slip from beneath a translucent veil, or choosing coverings so sheer they might as well have been a polite suggestion. The rules were strict, but the game was alive and well. So, as we take one last look at these gleaming strands and blushing cheeks, it's clear that medieval beauty was never just about appearance. It was a tangled web of social signaling, religious anxiety, and the ever-present risk of accidental scandal. A world where a drop too much beetroot or a glimpse of sunlit hair could tip you from piety to notoriety in the blink of an eye. And with that, let's step into the next gallery, where the rules of beauty get even stranger, and the pursuit of delicate appearance becomes an art form unto itself. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this. If you've ever wandered through a medieval portrait gallery, you might start to suspect that the higher your hat reached, the closer you were to sainthood. Or, at the very least, the higher your social standing. Yes, let's talk about the infamous Hennin, the iconic gravity-defying cone hat that made medieval women look like they were auditioning for a role in a fairy tale, or perhaps doubling as an early warning system for low-hanging door frames. By the 15th century, women across Europe, especially in France and Burgundy, were locked in a silent upward battle of status, craning their necks under hats that sometimes soared to 2 feet tall. These weren't just hats. They were velvet and silk declarations of nobility, as if walking around with a steeple on your head announced, "I am above you," literally and figuratively. The hennin wasn't content to sit politely atop the head either. It needed a wireframe to hold its shape, a sheer veil to float dramatically off the tip, and a fearless wearer who could navigate a candlelit feast without setting herself ablaze. If medieval TikTok existed, you'd find endless tutorials on how to stuff your hair into a hennin, braid by braid, until your scalp cried for mercy. Some women even shaved their foreheads to create more space for the hat. Forehead real estate was at a premium, and the higher the brow, the more refined you appeared. The process of getting ready for a banquet could easily double as basic training for a joust, especially when it came to ducking through doorways. Comfort, as you may have guessed, was never on the design checklist. But the hennin wasn't the only head-turner in the medieval arsenal. There were heart-shaped escoffions that looked suspiciously like 2 pastries glued to your temples, and butterfly hennins, where veils fanned out like wings, beautiful in theory, but about as practical as wearing a tent in a windstorm. These architectural marvels were perfect for drama and pageantry, and less ideal for sudden rain or, say, emerging from a carriage with dignity. Outside the rarefied air of the aristocracy, most women kept things simpler. Linen caps, modest veils, and circlets reigned among commoners, who preferred their headgear without the risk of head injury or mistaken identity as siege weaponry. Even the clergy weighed in, issuing warnings that such ostentatious hats were a gateway to vanity, sin, and, presumably, chronic neck pain. But as with most questionable fashion trends in history, the hennin endured among those eager to show they had both money and a strong sense of balance. While women were busy measuring their status in inches of silk and wire, men had their own competitive accessories: feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and shoes so extravagantly pointy they could double as dueling foils were all the rage. If your shoes could sweep the floor before you entered the room, you were clearly a man of means. But when it came to beauty ideals, the real masterpiece was the delicate art of appearing, well, delicate. Medieval standards for the perfect woman didn't call for athletic prowess or hourglass curves. Instead, the ideal was a figure so slim and ethereal, she seemed to have subsisted on honey water, whispered poetry, and perhaps a single grape every other Thursday. Manuals of the day didn't recommend strength or stamina. The only heavy lifting expected was that of a silk veil, demurely lifted for a brief glance, before retreating behind a wall of modesty, and, if you timed it right, a convincing swoon. Looking robust or too healthy was never the goal. The sweet spot hovered somewhere between too frail to carry a bucket and just well enough to play the lute while seated. The aim was to project a willowy, graceful silhouette, a look that said, "I am too noble for manual labor, but still hearty enough to survive a mild winter and recite melancholy sonnets by candlelight." If you happened to be too thin, that was another problem entirely. In an age where famine lurked in the wings and the plague was always a guest at the feast, looking gaunt suggested you were one bad harvest away from starring in a cautionary tale. A slight roundness to the face or hips was considered healthy, even desirable, as it hinted at fertility and the ability to outlast a cold snap with your poetic sensibilities intact. Clothing played its part in this illusion. Dresses were cinched just below the bust, creating an early version of the empire waist and stretching the torso for that elongated, ethereal look. If nature didn't grant you the perfect proportions, tightly laced kirtles and surcoats could help, squeezing you into noble fragility without the full commitment of later corsets. The rules were specific. Look as if you might faint at any moment, but never as if you were already halfway to the afterlife. For men, the script was slightly different. Broad shoulders, strong legs, and the capacity to wield a sword with a flourish were all admired. But even among the upper classes, a lean build and refined posture were preferred over brawny strength. A delicate balance of presence and restraint was the order of the day. Think less bouncer, more poet-warrior, ready to compose a love sonnet or win a duel without ever breaking a sweat. Eyes, meanwhile, were the secret weapon of medieval beauty. A woman's eyes could convey layers of virtue, piety, and just a hint of melancholy, all without uttering a word. The ideal eyes were luminous, large, and clear, as if they'd spent years gazing soulfully at stained glass windows and contemplating the mysteries of existence. Poets couldn't get enough of them, describing eyes as orbs of purity, dew-kissed portals to heaven, or reservoirs of devotion, never, you'll notice, as red-rimmed or sleep-deprived from late-night butter churning. In Northern Europe, light-colored eyes, blue or grey, were particularly prized, symbols of innocence and the kind of unsullied spirit that might faint at the mention of scandal. In Southern Europe, a pair of dark, expressive eyes could be equally alluring, provided they came attached to a noble lineage and, ideally, a substantial dowry. Enhancing your gaze, however, was an exercise in creativity. Forget mascara or liner pens. A dab of charcoal soot and a prayer were your best bet. Some women risked irritation or accidental smoky eyes by darkening their lashes with powder, but most simply relied on candlelight and strategic glances. Want to look wide-eyed? Stand near a flickering candle and hope for the best. Want to appear virtuous? Keep your gaze lowered, even if it means tripping over the family cat. Oddly enough, slightly tearful eyes were seen as incredibly attractive. They suggested sensitivity, a deep well of emotion, and perhaps that you just finished a heartfelt prayer or endured a particularly moving sermon. Artificial tears weren't an option, but staring into a smoky fire or braving mild embarrassment in public could achieve the desired effect. Eye contact itself was a strategic dance. Too much, and you risk being labeled bold or scandalously French. Too little, and you look suspicious, as if plotting heresy. The trick was to master the art of the upward glance, long enough to show your soul, brief enough to preserve your reputation, and hopefully not so sudden that you startled your suitor. But let's pull back the velvet curtain on one of medieval beauty's less glamorous details. Breath. Yes, breath. While poets waxed rhapsodic about rosebud lips and teeth like pearls, they politely skipped over what happened when those lips parted and real life wafted out. Medieval oral hygiene was more aspirational than actual, with minty fresh breath ranking somewhere between unicorns and functional plumbing in terms of everyday miracles. Still, having a gently scented mouth was considered a sign of youth, health, and a diet that didn't rely exclusively on garlic and pickled herring. So what did medieval women do to avoid dragon breath? They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, and cinnamon sticks, not because it made their teeth gleam, but because it made close conversation marginally less hazardous. Think of it as the Middle Ages' answer to breath mints, only without the sugar rush or the possibility of a refreshing commercial jingle. For those with access to apothecaries, herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh could be found. But these luxuries were used sparingly. Opening your mouth too wide in public was frowned upon, so discreet freshening was the name of the game. Toothbrushing, as we know it today, wasn't standard practice. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or gnawed on fibrous twigs, which doubled as handy fidget tools during long-winded poetry recitations. Halitosis, though universally unappealing, was not the scandal it is today. Everyone had bigger fish to fry, like surviving winter or not being accused of sorcery for carrying an unusually fragrant pomander. For noble women, the trick was to stay charming while minimizing offense. Conversations took place at a respectful distance. Public affection was minimal, and when in doubt, a decorative pomander filled with herbs could be gracefully waved near your own nose to keep things pleasant. If all else failed, a well-timed fan and a contemplative sigh could buy you a few more minutes of social grace before the next round of garlic-laden stew. And so, in the medieval gallery of beauty ideals, it wasn't just about looking the part. It was about mastering the fine art of appearing delicate, mysterious, and ever so slightly out of reach, all while navigating a world where your accessories might double as siege weaponry and your breath as a cautionary tale. Speaking of which, if you thought hats and hemlines were complicated, just wait until we open the next exhibit. Because in medieval times, a smile wasn't just a curve of the lips. It was a battleground of scent and morality, ready to launch 1,000 whispered judgments. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. Picture yourself strolling through the candlelit corridors of our ever-changing historical gallery, the air thick with the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and a hint of something less definable, perhaps the ghost of medieval cologne. Now, let's pause at an exhibit that, at first glance, might seem almost ordinary. A row of smiling faces, each carefully painted in the style of the Middle Ages. But take a closer look. Notice anything odd? That's right, nobody's actually grinning. In fact, most of these folks look like they're auditioning for the world's most solemn poetry reading. In the medieval world, a smile was less a gesture of warmth and more a high-stakes gamble. best reserved for those rare moments when you absolutely had to show teeth. And believe me, with dentistry being what it was, you often didn't want to. Let's talk teeth. Today, a dazzling smile can make or break a dating profile. But back in the 1300s, teeth were mostly for survival, not seduction. Forget pearly whites. By the time you hit 30, your dental prospects had usually shifted from passable to potentially alarming. Bread, porridge, the occasional mug of mead, these were the staples of a medieval diet, and they were not kind to one's molars. Sugar hadn't invaded European pantries yet, but even basic grains had a knack for sabotaging enamel. And as for dental care, well, let's just say the toothbrush was still centuries away from its big debut. Dental floss? Only if you count unraveling your own tunic and hoping for the best. Toothaches were common, tooth decay was rampant, and the dreaded trip to the medieval dentist was more like an exorcism with bonus pliers. If your teeth weren't actively haunting you, you counted yourself lucky. Despite all this, a healthy set of teeth was quietly admired. Nobody was writing sonnets about bicuspids, but white. Even teeth were considered a sign of youth, fortune, and perhaps divine favor. Still, no one was out there doing their best toothpaste commercial impression. The demure, closed-lip smile was all the rage. More, I might be composing a sonnet in my head, then I'm thrilled to see you. Some women, determined to outwit centuries of dental neglect, resorted to homemade tooth powders. Sage, salt, the odd bit of ground coral, these were the tools of the trade. The effect was, generously speaking, mildly helpful and mostly abrasive. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with the medieval equivalent of sandpaper, hoping to uncover a hint of ivory beneath centuries of bread residue. But for the most part, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. If you scan medieval art, you'll notice that even the holiest of saints keep their lips sealed. Apparently, even angels knew when to keep their dental secrets hidden. Men weren't immune to the perils of medieval dentistry either. The gallant knight might woo a fair maiden with his bravery and his jawline, but no bard ever praised a hero's dazzling grin. There's a reason the troubadours focused on eyes, hair and hands, never on breath or bite alignment. And who could blame them? Let's shift our spotlight to the gentleman of the age. What did it mean to be a handsome man when gym memberships were replaced by jousts, and the only six-pack anyone cared about was a sack of mead? The ideal look fell somewhere between could win a duel, and probably writes excellent poetry about dueling. Nobility was all about balance, tall, lean, broad-shouldered, with just enough muscle to suggest you might swing a sword if your squire happened to be napping. Too muscular, and you risked looking like you actually did manual labor, a definite faux pas. Too soft, and you might be mistaken for someone who'd never left the banquet table. A defined jaw, high cheekbones, and a straight nose. These were the features of choice. Think less village blacksmith, and more prince in an illuminated manuscript. When it came to facial hair, you had options. A well-tended beard, or the clean-shaven look, each perfectly acceptable as long as it appeared intentional. You didn't want to look like you'd gotten lost in the forest for a week, unless, of course, you were back from a pilgrimage, in which case a little stubble was practically a badge of honor. Hair was another arena for medieval beauty ambitions. Shoulder-length locks, often styled into soft curls, were very much in vogue among the nobility. And yes, some men did use curling irons, though the process was less salon chic and more, try not to set your hair on fire in the process. Herbal rinses added a touch of shine, though the end result was often more fragrant than fashionable, because nothing says, "I'm above manual labor," like spending an hour getting your fringe just right, possibly while your page boy looks on in silent despair. Clothes made the man, or at least helped him fake it. Padded shoulders, snug tunics, and cinched waists all worked together to sculpt the ideal silhouette. drawing the eye to a posture that was equal parts regal and faintly disdainful. A nobleman didn't slouch, he glided, as if his bones were made of etiquette and mild contempt. And if you happened to be naturally muscular, that was acceptable, as long as your muscles came from combat, not from hauling barrels. Fighting in wars was dignified. Sweating over farm work? Absolutely not. Above all, the trick was to appear effortlessly attractive, as if beauty was something inherited alongside your estate and your favorite falcon. Today, we might call this hot without trying. Except in the Middle Ages, you achieved it by being born into the right family and never getting caught with mud on your boots. But now, let's address the elephant in the gallery: hygiene. In an era where plumbing was a rumor and bathing was more a suggestion than a habit, managing scent became a kind of high art. But it wasn't the glamorous, walk through a perfume cloud sort of affair. It was more like tactical aroma warfare. People did bathe, but not as often as we might hope, and plague years didn't exactly help matters. So, to avoid offending God, neighbors, or the local livestock, medieval men and women turned to the aromatic powers of herbs, oils, and cunningly concealed perfume pouches. Allow me to introduce you to the pomander, a small, hollow orb made of silver or gold, worn on a chain or pinned to a sleeve. Inside, a bouquet of strongly scented herbs, cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and the ever-mysterious powder of roses. These weren't just for style points. They were the medieval equivalent of walking around with your own personal air freshener, a kind of olfactory force field. If you've ever wished for a portable Febreze grenade, you would have fit right in at court. The aristocracy embraced the art of aroma with gusto. Perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, even combs soaked in floral waters, all fair game in the quest to smell better than your surroundings. Hair was often doused in floral infusions or vinegar rinses, which, at best, masked the scent of sweat and, at worst, left you smelling like a salad with ambition. Sweat was an unavoidable fact of life, thanks to heavy garments and the complete absence of deodorant. The solution? Layers of linen, which could be washed more often than wool or silk. Some people tucked herbal sachets between their underlayers, battling body odor with fragrant optimism. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in bustling cities. But the church's growing suspicion of communal nudity eventually made bathing a somewhat controversial pastime. When in doubt, people turned to dry bathing, which, in practice, meant wiping yourself down with a cloth, spritzing on some rose water, and pretending you'd just stepped out of a spa. Spoiler alert, it wasn't very convincing. Of course, there were always the overachievers. Some slipped flower petals into their shoes, or filled their bed linens with dried herbs, hoping to give off an aura of someone who had recently passed near a garden. The result was mixed, but the effort was there. But medieval beauty went far deeper than clean faces and scented gloves. Physical appearance was tangled up with morality in ways that would make any modern influencer sweat. A beautiful face wasn't just something to flaunt. It was a sign of virtue, a mark of divine favor, or, depending on the day, a trap set by the devil himself. To be beautiful was to walk a perilous tightrope, balancing on the edge between admiration and suspicion. On one hand, clear skin, symmetrical features, and a pale complexion were praised as evidence of a pure soul. Poets, preachers, and painters alike declared that beauty was a window to inner goodness. If you were lovely, it meant you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least, unlikely to steal the family goat. But, as with all good things, there was a catch. If you seemed aware of your own beauty, or, heaven forbid, used it to your advantage, your virtue was instantly called into question. Vanity was a sin, after all, and too much attention to one's appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or, the ultimate medieval insult, French tendencies. Preachers warned that women's beauty could lure men into sin, which, by some impressive logical gymnastics, was entirely the woman's fault. Eve had started it, and medieval Europe enthusiastically kept the tradition alive. A woman who wore makeup, revealed a lock of hair, or fluttered her lashes at the wrong night, could quickly find herself accused of everything from moral weakness to outright witchcraft. Beauty could be seen as an illusion, a magical glamour cast by sorceresses to lead good men astray. If that sounds dramatic, remember, this was an age when a bad harvest could get you accused of consorting with demons. Meanwhile, those who were plain or ill-featured weren't let off the hook either. Sometimes they were seen as morally suspect, or at best, simply unfortunate victims of fate. The idea that your face was a reflection of your soul wasn't just a poetic flourish, it was doctrine in many circles. So the rules were clear as mud. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Glow with virtue, but never act like you know it. And above all, don't outshine the local lord's wife unless you enjoy the prospect of a silent convent or a sudden, suspicious illness. Beauty, in the end, wasn't just about looking good. It was a moral obstacle course, an endless balancing act between humility, allure, and whatever dangerous powder happened to be in your makeup kit. And so, as we leave behind the subtle, scented intrigues of the medieval beauty hall, we find ourselves at the threshold of another legendary chapter in our gallery's collection. For now, we're trading velvet and rosewater for the clash of armor and the shimmer of immortality. Step with me into the gallery's eastern wing, where the torchlight flickers across a row of statues that seem to breathe. There they stand, the Persian immortals. But don't let the silence fool you. These figures were never just another set of royal bodyguards. They were the living, marching signature at the bottom of every Persian imperial decree. Their story begins in the dawn-lit corridors of the Achaemenid Empire, beneath the watchful gaze of Cyrus the Great. Yes, the same Cyrus who thought an empire should feel less like a collection of provinces and more like an all-consuming, well-oiled bureaucracy with excellent taste in carpets. Persia, at that time, was transforming itself from a patchwork kingdom into a supersized, multi-ethnic juggernaut. And Cyrus, ever the savvy CEO, realized that if you want to run a continent, you need more than chatty governors and tax collectors. You need a backbone made of flesh, loyalty, and the kind of discipline that would make a modern drill sergeant reach for his stress ball. Thus the Immortals were born, a force not only built for war, but for spectacle, intimidation, and the kind of brand recognition most marketing teams would kill for. Now, let's talk about the name. Immortals. What a title. It doesn't just sound imposing. It's practically an ancient version of a verified blue check. But this wasn't just royal marketing spin. The brilliance was in the logistics. According to our friend Herodotus, the Immortals were always maintained at exactly 10,000 strong. Lose a man to a stray arrow or a bad oyster, and another would step in before the next sunrise. From the outside, it looked as if these soldiers could never shrink, never falter, never die. A clever illusion? Absolutely. But psychological warfare is part of the game. To the world, the Immortals weren't individuals. They were the eternal heartbeat of Persia, a river of steel and silk that never ran dry. Their immortality wasn't about dodging the Reaper. It was about the undying idea of Persian power itself. Of course, not just anyone could don those robes and join the 10,000. To become an immortal was to pass through a crucible of privilege, discipline, and relentless scrutiny. Most recruits were drawn from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, families with names long enough to require their own scrolls, and with proven records of loyalty. Training started early, with boys learning to ride, shoot, and obey before most kids today can tie their shoes. Their discipline wasn't the casual sort you find at a weekend boot camp. It was the kind that makes you wonder if anyone ever actually laughed in the barracks. Loyalty to the king was absolute, and composure wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. The immortals were expected to be walking embodiments of Persian order, calm, controlled, and as predictable as a royal accountant. But let's not forget their style. The immortals were peacocks with daggers. Their uniforms were masterpieces, embroidered tunics and trousers in deep reds and purples, the colors of royalty and command. Underneath, they wore flexible scale armor, designed to turn aside both blades and the occasional envious glance. Their shields were woven from wicker, deceptively light, but sturdy enough to make any Greek hoplite's shield feel a bit old-fashioned. And then there was the headdress, a soft felt cap called a tiara, sometimes pulled low to obscure the face and add a whiff of mystery. Unlike the Greeks, who seemed convinced that everyone should look like a unique bronze action figure, the immortals prized uniformity. 10,000 men moving in near silence, all dressed and armed alike, conjured an image less like a human army and more like a force of nature. Imagine watching a velvet curtain sweep across the battlefield, except this curtain carried spears, bows, and a reputation that made seasoned warriors rethink their career choices. Each immortal was armed for versatility, a short spear for thrusting, a bow and quiver for ranged combat, a short sword for close encounters, and that ever-present wicker shield. But their true power was in their mobility and relentless training. They could march across deserts and mountains, keeping formation where lesser armies would dissolve into a collection of tired complaints. Their drills emphasized agility and endurance over brute strength, making them as effective in the palace corridor as on the open plain. It wasn't about raw power. It was about delivering the same result every time, without a hint of uncertainty. Theirs was an existence defined by precision and unity, a living tapestry of Persian order, woven anew each day. When the immortals went to war, it was as much theatre as combat. Drums thundered, dust boiled up behind them, and yet their faces stayed eerily blank. There were no heroic shouts or chest-thumping boasts, just a silent, synchronized advance that unsettled even the bravest foes. To face them was to stand before, not just a unit of soldiers, but an idea. The empire itself, marching forward, unblinking and inexorable. The psychological impact was immense. Many battles were won before the first arrow was loosed, as the enemy's resolve melted in the face of that relentless, almost inhuman composure. If you've ever frozen when a group of stone-faced gym regulars walk into the weight room, you have a sliver of the experience. But immortality, like any good magic trick, came at a price. For the men themselves, being an immortal wasn't just a privilege. It was a total life commitment, equal parts status symbol and golden cage. The state provided everything, their food, their silk-lined quarters, even their wine. But none of this was for comfort. It was about control. The immortals belonged to the empire, not their families. Marriage was allowed, but family life could be interrupted at any moment by the call of duty. Hesitation was fatal to one's career. If a man flinched or faltered, he was quietly replaced. The number had to remain 10,000, always, without exception. Their discipline extended into every corner of life. Days began before dawn. Drills were conducted in silence, and meals were communal and calculated for maximum stamina. Luxuries were discouraged. The immortals were not pampered noblemen. They were the sharpened tools of the empire. Their duties, too, extended far beyond the battlefield. In times of peace, immortals served as the king's personal guard, standing watch in the shadowy halls of Persepolis or Susa. But their presence was never merely ceremonial. These men were the silent sentinels against assassination, the quiet monitors of court intrigues, and the stern reminders of royal authority in every volatile corner of the empire. Their mere presence could quell dissent before a word was spoken. In a world where a thrown goblet might start a rebellion, having the Immortals at your back was the ancient equivalent of a 24/7 security system run by the world's most intimidating HOA. Much of what we know about the Immortals comes from both Persian records and the wide-eyed reports of Greek historians, who, as you might expect, saw them as equal parts terrifying and strangely glamorous. It was under Darius the Great that the unit reached its operational and symbolic peak. Darius, who took the throne after a burst of palace drama worthy of a reality show reunion, saw the Immortals as both his sword and his shield. He didn't just use them to enforce his will. He paraded them at festivals, posed them in monumental carvings, and made them the face of imperial stability. The Immortals became part of the Empire's public relations campaign. Their every appearance was a reminder that the king's reach was long and his patience limited. But Darius also pushed them to evolve. No longer just ceremonial guards or shock troops, the Immortals became the core of Persian. Combined arms tactics, moving in concert with archers, cavalry, and chariots. Their training expanded to include siege warfare and battlefield coordination. Greek observers marveled at their ability to fire arrows in synchronized volleys while advancing behind their shields, never breaking formation, never showing fear. The darker side of their legend was forged in these years as well. The Immortals became infamous as the king's enforcers, dispatched to crush rebellions from Babylon to Egypt with ruthless efficiency. Their arrival was both a promise and a threat. The king's will is inexhaustible, and his patience with dissent is measured in seconds. Their image was immortalized in stone, literally. The reliefs at Persepolis don't just depict soldiers. They show a line of nearly identical men, frozen in perfect formation, the embodiment of imperial order carved into eternity. These weren't portraits of individuals. They were propaganda, meant to impress on every subject and visitor that the Immortals were always present, always armed, and above all, always watching. But the real crucible for the Immortals, their most legendary and, some would say, humbling trial, came during the reign of Xerxes the Great, at the infamous pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This wasn't just a battle. It was a clash of philosophies, with Persian imperial order squaring off against the fierce independence of the Greek city-states. Xerxes, determined to bulldoze his way into the Greek heartland, brought the Immortals as his personal vanguard. Their reputation marched ahead of them, 10,000 warriors who never faltered, who served the king with a devotion that bordered on religious. The Greeks shuddered at the thought of facing them. And then came the moment of truth. When the fighting began at Thermopylae, Xerxes expected the Immortals to make quick work of the defenders. After all, what chance did a few thousand Greeks, Spartans included, stand against the best-trained unit of the world's largest empire? But the narrow pass gave the Greeks a home field advantage, worthy of a playoff series. The Immortals, with all their skill, found their signature bows nearly useless, their shorter spears unable to reach past the Greek phalanx. Here, in the tight confines, it was discipline against discipline. But the Spartans had spent their entire lives preparing for just this moment. Wave after wave, the Immortals pressed forward, and wave after wave, they were driven back. Herodotus, never one to miss a chance to gloat, recorded that the Immortals fared no better than any other Persian soldier. The illusion of their invincibility cracked. For the first time, the Immortals bled, fell, and died in numbers that could not be easily disguised. And yet, even in defeat, the legend endured. The Immortals regrouped, adapted, and marched on. Their myth wasn't built on winning every battle or on individual heroics. It was founded on something deeper, something more enduring. Immortality, for them, wasn't about being untouchable. It was about never giving up, never letting the Empire's heartbeat falter, no matter the odds. That is what made them terrifying, and that is why their story, like their formation, remains unbroken in the memory of history. So as we drift away from the shadowy gallery of the immortals, remember, their immortality was never just about steel and sinew. It was about the idea that an empire could make itself eternal, not by never losing, but by never ceasing to endure. And as we trace their journey into the next chapter, keep in mind, the most fascinating part of the Persian immortals wasn't just their training or battlefield tactics. Let's step behind the velvet rope of myth and take a good, unhurried look at the real machinery that kept the Persian immortals ticking. Forget the swordplay and the shimmering silk for a moment. The real magic, the thing that made 1,000 generations whisper about these men, was found far from the chaos of battle. It was in the ledgers. If you want to know what made the immortals truly immortal, you have to think less in terms of sorcery and more in terms of paperwork. Yes, it's time to tip our hats to the unsung hero of world domination, bureaucracy. Picture a silent, sunlit office in Persepolis. Scrolls stacked high, scribes hunched over, and a supervisor with a beard as immaculate as his handwriting. This was where an immortal's fate was decided. When a warrior fell, struck in battle, lost to fever, or simply worn out by the grind of endless marches, there was no mourning period, no grand send-off, not even a commemorative fruit basket. The replacement process was so swift, so utterly impersonal, that the unit always, and I mean always, stood at exactly 10,000 strong. That number wasn't just a boast. It was a logistical commandment, a sacred Excel spreadsheet, 2 millennia ahead of its time. The secret was a standing pool of replacements, always kept ready in the capital. Think of it as the world's most grueling waiting room. Young men, each one a hopeful, anxious understudy, were drilled, inspected, and rotated through lesser assignments until a vacancy appeared. Lose a man in the Egyptian desert? A replacement was already lacing up his sandals in Susa, preparing to step into the precise spot, shield at the ready, as if nothing had happened. Like a well-oiled conveyor belt, the immortal system made the line unbreakable, not by force, but by design. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about the psychology of awe. The endless river of replacements sent a chilling signal. If you killed an immortal, another appeared instantly, faceless and relentless. The individual didn't matter. The presence did. The machine, as cold and tireless as an ancient automaton, never paused for grief or tribute. It was a system that made the very concept of defeat seem pointless. There was no empty space, no visible weakness, just a seamless, immortal whole. To keep this human engine running, Persian officers known as Hazarapatis, each commanding 1,000 men, wielded immense authority. 10 Hazarapatis formed the backbone beneath the supreme commander. Beneath them, a dense lattice of junior officers, scribes, and quartermasters ensured that every shield, every ration, every slice of dried fruit was accounted for. If an immortal's family fell out of favor or dabbled in treason, the solution was swift and silent. A replacement appeared, and the line moved forward, unblinking. Scandal? Drama? Not in this empire. The comparison to modern HR departments might seem almost too easy. But let's face it, Persian administration was the original corporate ladder. And the immortals were its model employees, never missing a shift, never letting the side down. Their greatest strength wasn't just courage, but the certainty that the line would never break. That's not the stuff of heroic poetry, but it's the backbone of every empire that's ever lasted longer than a TikTok trend. Of course, the immortals were more than just soldiers. They were diplomats, enforcers, and living propaganda. Let's set the scene. A foreign court, the air thick with incense and suspicion, and in walks a detachment of immortals. Not shouting, not even speaking, just gliding silently, robes gleaming, weapons untouched, faces unreadable beneath soft felt headdresses. There's no need for threats. Their mere presence is the message. The Persian king sees all, remembers all, and above all, replaces all. In the satrapies, the provinces that made up this sprawling empire, immortals were always stationed within easy reach of every local governor. They rarely intervened in civil affairs, but everyone knew a single whisper of rebellion, a hint of disloyalty, and a squad could appear at your door before you'd even finished your morning pomegranate. Within the royal court, their role became even more complex. Ceremonial guards one moment, flanking the king at Nowruz festivals, coronations, and diplomatic banquets, yet always watching, always listening. Some modern historians have suggested that the immortals operated as a kind of ancient intelligence agency, sniffing out treason with the same efficiency they polished their spears. The idea that loyalty was a choice. Not in this kingdom. It was a requirement, enforced with the quiet discipline of 1,000 watchful eyes. This is where the legend gets its uncanny edge. The Greeks, who worshipped individual glory and dramatic sacrifice, found the immortals eerie. Herodotus himself described them with a blend of awe and suspicion, the faceless army that could not be seen to die. To the Persians, though, this was brilliance. Presence, not personality, was what mattered. War was just one tool. The immortals embodied the idea that an empire is held together by symbols as much as by swords. Fear and awe, those twin pillars of imperial power, were embodied in every synchronized step they took. But no system, no matter how flawless, is immune to the slow rot of complacency. As the Achaemenid Empire aged, so did its most famous guardians. Persian kings grew more entangled in courtly intrigue and less interested in the realities of the battlefield. The immortals, once hard-edged exemplars of discipline, began to shift. Under rulers like Artaxerxes and Darius III, the elite guard became more ornamental than operational. They still wore the robes, still marched in perfect lines. But the spark was fading. Recruitment standards slipped. Where once only the most loyal and proven warriors were chosen, now political connections and family favors crept in. Nobles jostled to secure coveted spots for their sons, whether or not they deserved them. The result was a unit that looked perfect on parade, but had lost something essential, the spirit that made the machine run. Uniformity without soul, discipline without conviction. The cracks became impossible to ignore when Alexander the Great came crashing through the empire's front door. In 331 BCE, at the Battle of Gaugamela, the immortals took their place at the heart of the Persian line, determined to defend Darius III. They fought bravely, but Alexander's Macedonian phalanx was a force the likes of which the ancient world had never seen. Outflanked, outmaneuvered, and outpaced, the immortals found themselves not only physically overwhelmed, but symbolically broken. The legendary backup system faltered. The myth of the unbroken line was shattered. No matter how quickly replacements arrived, the illusion could not be sustained. When Alexander marched into Persepolis, he found not a defiant army of 10,000, but a hollowed-out institution. The palace stood, but the immortals were not there to defend it. For the first time in centuries, the line had failed. The legend, it seemed, had reached its twilight. Or had it? Because even in defeat, the immortals refused to quietly vanish. Alexander, ever the opportunist, borrowed Persian traditions, including those of the immortals, blending them with his own to craft an even grander imperial image. Centuries later, the Sasanian Empire would field a new elite force, sometimes dubbed immortals by historians, who sought to revive the old mystique. They weren't a direct continuation, but the echoes were unmistakable. 10,000 strong, armored and disciplined, a living myth reshaped for a new age. Even after Persia had faded from the map, the blueprint persisted. Generals and emperors across the world took note. Napoleon himself, a man who knew a thing or two about ambition, admired Persian military organization, and studied the immortal structure. The idea of an unbreakable, instantly replenished elite force became a recurring dream for rulers from Rome to Byzantium, from ancient Baghdad to the courts of Renaissance Europe. Culturally, the immortals seeped into legend and popular imagination. Modern films and video games love to depict them as monsters, masked assassins, or supernatural terrors. But the truth is far more fascinating, and, in a way, far more chilling. These were ordinary men, made extraordinary by relentless training, psychological discipline, and a system that valued continuity above all. No need for magic or superpowers. All it took was the certainty that if you faced one immortal, you faced all of them, forever. Stone carvings in Persepolis still show them, locked in eternal procession, their spears a silent forest of discipline. The myth of the immortals lives on in the military doctrines of countless armies, in the whispered fears of those who understand that power, when endlessly replaced and ruthlessly organized, can become something disturbingly close to true immortality. So, as we leave this shadowy corridor of the gallery, the immortals' story lingers, not because of their conquests, but because they prove that the real key to power is not just strength or courage, but the machinery that ensures the line never breaks. Their greatest weapon was not their sword, but the idea that the empire behind them would never falter. In the end, perhaps that is what immortality really means, not living forever as individuals, but becoming a force that the world can never quite forget. And now, as the echoes of those silent sandals fade and the velvet ropes part, our path leads to another forgotten corridor of martial legend. If you thought only men wore the armor of myth, think again. Before there were legends of the Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, feared and respected from the Black Sea all the way to the Alai Mountains. Let's take a detour from the dusty myths of Greek Amazons and step into the windswept grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, where Scythian women were busy making history, while the rest of the world was still deciding if women should be allowed to hold a spear. Forget about embroidery circles and quiet domesticity. These women were more likely to be found, galloping across the plains, arrows flying, hair streaming behind them in the wind. In Scythian culture, a woman wielding a bow wasn't even worth a raised eyebrow. It was just Tuesday. Greek historians, who were accustomed to societies where women's athletic events involved little more than weaving competitions, were slack-jawed when they encountered these tribes. Herodotus, never one to understate a good story, wrote about entire clans where a woman couldn't even think about marriage before she'd killed at least one enemy in battle. At the time, his tales sounded suspiciously like the kind of thing you'd tell your friends to impress them at a symposium. But modern archaeology has done what it does best: dig up receipts. Across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, burial mounds, kurgans as they're called, have revealed the skeletons of young women, laid to rest with their bows, swords, and sometimes the very wounds that ended their lives. There was one skeleton, armored and resolute even in death, with an arrowhead still embedded in her spine. Her grave goods weren't ceremonial trinkets. They were the well-used tools of a seasoned fighter. This wasn't a cosplay. This was her life, and her death on the steppe. Scythian society, by its very nature, demanded resilience and mobility from everyone, regardless of gender. The steppe was an equal opportunity employer. From a young age, girls learned to ride and shoot as well as any boy. Their uniforms were leather trousers, practical armor, and often tattoos that signaled their rank and achievements. On horseback and in the chaos of combat, you'd have a hard time distinguishing Scythian women from their male counterparts. It was only after the dust settled and the horses were unsaddled that gender roles took on their more familiar, rigid forms. A Scythian woman might spend her morning raining arrows down on invaders, and her afternoon tending to ritual duties or raising children. There was no contradiction here. These roles coexisted, balancing each other in a rhythm dictated by survival. It's not hard to see how Greek travelers, squinting into the horizon and seeing leather-clad archers with flowing hair, might have spun tales of Amazons, those legendary women warriors who haunted the edges of Greek imagination. But while the Amazons of myth faded into the realm of fantasy, the Scythians were all too real. They fought Persians, clashed with Greeks, and sent chills down the spines of Macedonian generals. For centuries, they thundered across the steppe, men and women united by necessity, their legends carried on the wind long after their horses' hoofprints vanished. Now, let's fast forward and shift continents to a scene that would feel at home in a blockbuster action film, but unfolded in the heart of West Africa. In the small kingdom of Dahomey, known today as Benin, another extraordinary force of women warriors emerged. The French, with all their colonial condescension, dubbed them the Dahomey Amazons, a name that misses as much as it reveals. Their true name was the Agojie, and their legend is anything but myth. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agojie had become the king's elite royal guard. Think less palace attendants and more SWAT team with a taste for machetes. The origins of the Agojie are still debated. Some say they started as elephant hunters, others as palace sentinels. What's certain is that these women became the backbone of Dahomey's military might. Recruited young, often handpicked for their strength or fierce temperament, Agojie girls were whisked away from their families and thrown into a crucible of training that would make most modern boot camps look like spa retreats. Their days were filled with obstacle courses, bristling with thorns, sparring matches with real blades, and lessons in discipline that brooked no dissent. Celibacy and unwavering loyalty to the king were not optional. They were sworn oaths, binding as steel. When it came to fashion, the Agojie favored practicality over pageantry. Braided sashes, muskets slung across their backs, gleaming machetes, and sturdy clubs. But their most formidable weapon was psychological. European observers, schooled in the gender conventions of Victorian parlors, were often shaken by the Agojie's composure and brutality. One French officer, his hand perhaps still trembling as he wrote, described watching an Agojie warrior rush into battle, slice open a man's throat, and then, with the same poise as a hostess tidying up after a dinner party, calmly wipe her blade clean. These were not figurehead soldiers. They were the shock troops, the first in, the last out, and the ones who kept their enemies awake at night. When the Franco-Dahomean Wars erupted in the 1890s, the Agojie squared off against the best France could throw at them. Outnumbered and outgunned, they didn't retreat to the safety of the palace. Instead, they launched daring night raids, set ambushes in the dense jungle, and fought for every street, every inch of their kingdom. Their ferocity forced French commanders to rethink their tactics, and perhaps to question some deeply held assumptions about who gets to be a warrior. But the impact of the Agojie extended far beyond the battlefield. In a world where men held almost every lever of power, these women carved out a realm of authority and autonomy. They advised the king, handled ceremonial duties, and even shaped foreign policy, not from behind a screen, but with blades in hand and eyes forward. The French eventually won the war, but they couldn't erase the legend of the Agojie. Their spirit lived on, inspiring everything from West African folklore to the fierce Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. Still, as impressive as fiction can be, it rarely holds a candle to the improbable realities of history. Now, let's slip quietly through the shoji screens of medieval Japan, where the mist is thick and legends ride with the dawn. Among the towering figures of the samurai, one woman stands out, a silhouette sharpened by both myth and memory. Tomoe Gosen, a name that still echoes in Japanese folklore, was a warrior who turned the rigid expectations of her era on their head. She lived in the late 12th century, during the Genpei War, a savage conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that would ultimately give birth to the shogunate. Tomoe Gozen wasn't content to serve tea or pen poetry from the safety of the veranda. She was a commander, a master archer, and a swordswoman whose skill was whispered about with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Her story is immortalized in the Haiku Monogatari, a sweeping war epic that straddles the line between history and legend, always with a flair for the dramatic. According to the text, Tomoe was strikingly beautiful, with skin as white as snow, long hair that cascaded down her back, and features that could charm the most hardened warrior. But just as you settle in for a classic tale of courtly romance, the narrative pivots. She was also a force of nature on the battlefield, an archer of uncanny accuracy, and a swordswoman worth 1,000 men. In her world, beauty and lethality were not opposites. They were intertwined, and Tomoe embodied both. She served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a warlord, and, according to some sources, a lover. But Tomoe was no mere camp follower or battlefield nurse. When battles raged, she led troops, commanded assaults, and fought in the thickest part of the melee. Her most famous moment came at the Battle of Awasu in 1184. Surrounded by rival Minamoto forces, Yoshinaka ordered his last stand. Tomoe, refusing to flee, chose to fight. During the chaos, she is said to have spotted a charging enemy horseman, dismounted him with sheer force, wrestled him to the ground, and, with cold precision, beheaded him right there. Then, as nonchalantly as if she were brushing dust from her kimono, she remounted and rode back into the fray. Did it all happen exactly as the stories say? Maybe, maybe not. Legends have a way of burnishing the improbable until it shines. But that image of Tomoe Gozen, serene and deadly amid the chaos, has endured for centuries. What became of her after the war remains a mystery. Some say she was captured and forced into marriage, others that she retreated into monastic life, and still others that she simply vanished, slipping away like a shadow into the fog. Whatever the truth, her legacy endures in Japanese theatre, folklore, and collective memory. In a society built on ceremony, hierarchy, and roles as rigid as lacquered armor, Tomoe Gozen was an anomaly, a woman who drew her sword not just for her lord, but for her own right to carve a place in a world that kept insisting she step aside. So, what do these stories of Scythian archers, Agojie warriors, and a samurai commander have in common? They all challenge the assumption that history's battlefields were reserved for men. They force us to rethink what it means to be strong, to lead, and to fight for a place in the world, no matter which century your horse is tethered in. And speaking of rebellion and defiance, our next gallery opens on a clash that shook an empire. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak. Let's step into the echoing marble halls of our after-hours museum, where the statues glare and the security cameras blink with mild disapproval. Tonight, rebellion takes center stage, embodied in women who refuse to accept the world as it was handed to them. If you listen, you might even catch the faint thunder of chariots, the slap of wrestling mats in a Mongol tent, or the clang of armor on a rain-soaked French battlefield. History, turns out, is not short on women who upended the status quo with nothing but grit, fury, and the occasional warhorse. First, we find ourselves in Roman Britain, in the chill air of the 1st century, as the empire struts about feeling invincible. The Romans have their aqueducts, their meticulously organized legions, and their tendency to build straight roads through anything that gets in their way, including entire cultures. But then there's Boudica, a queen whose hair was said to blaze like a bonfire, and whose temper, if you believe the Roman chroniclers, could torch an entire province. Boudica wasn't born for the spotlight. She was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, a tribe allowed to keep their patch of land so long as they played nice with Rome. But when Prasutagus shuffled off this mortal coil, the Romans decided to remind everyone who was really in charge. They seized the kingdom, disregarded his will, and delivered a public punishment to Boudica and her daughters so brutal that even by ancient standards it was meant as a warning to all: resist, and you will be broken. This, as you might guess, was not what happened. Instead, Boudica launched a full-scale insurrection that would have made even the most jaded Roman senator spill his imported wine. She called together the tribes of Britannia, and they answered her with spears, swords, and righteous anger. Boudica didn't just send messages from the safety of a palace. According to Tacitus, she rode at the front in a chariot, her daughters at her side, her long hair streaming behind her, bronze torque gleaming. Part priestess, part general, altogether terrifying. When her army descended upon Camulodunum, modern Colchester, they didn't knock politely. They burned the Roman settlement to ash, toppled statues, and left the survivors wishing they'd taken up pottery instead of imperial administration. Then came Londinium, the humble ancestor of London, which soon learned the hard way that city insurance didn't cover rampaging Celts. Over 70,000 Romans and collaborators are said to have died in the whirlwind that followed. For a brief moment, the Roman Empire itself seemed to tremble at the edge of the known world. But empire, as always, means paperwork and countermeasures. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, rallied his battered troops. He drew Boudica into a classic Roman meat grinder, a pitched battle where discipline and shield walls beat passion and numbers. Defeat was swift. Rather than endure the humiliation of capture, Boudica is said to have taken poison, leaving behind a legend far larger than her defeat. Even the Roman chroniclers, never ones to praise a barbarian, couldn't help but marvel at her audacity. Later centuries would turn Boudica into a symbol for every British rebellion. Every moment, someone decided enough was enough. Whether as a statue glaring over Westminster Bridge, or a name whispered in resistance, she remains the patron saint of giving the empire a very bad day. Let's drift now across the rolling steppes of Central Asia, where the air smells of grass, sweat, and a faint hint of horse. Here, the Mongol Empire is still young, still hungry, and still run by men who measure power in arrows loosed and land conquered. Yet, in this world of bearded warlords, one woman stands out, not for the sharpness of her blade, but for the terrifying certainty that she could pin you to the ground before breakfast: Kutulun, the wrestling princess of Mongolia. Kutulun was not content with being Genghis Khan's great-great-granddaughter. That was just her family tree. She was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a man who spent his life in a running feud with Kublai Khan, and who expected his children to be warriors first, everything else second. Kutulun excelled at the horse, the bow, and the battlefield, but where she really shone was on the wrestling field. Wrestling, for the Mongols, wasn't just a sport, it was a metaphor for power, a way to show who deserved to lead. Kutulun announced, with the casual confidence of someone who's never lost a match, that she would only marry the man who could defeat her in a wrestling bout. The suitors lined up, fueled by ambition, bravado, and the sort of overconfidence usually reserved for reality show contestants. They bet horses, gold, entire herds. Kutulun beat them all. Her collection of 10,000 horses became legendary, and so did the number of bruised egos limping home across the steppe. If Tinder had existed, her profile would have read, undefeated, unimpressed, and in possession of more horses than the average small nation. But Kutulun wasn't just tossing men around for sport. She rode into battle alongside her father, sometimes commanding troops herself, sometimes breaking enemy lines with her sheer presence. Kaidu trusted her above all his children, and there were whispers, scandalous, unthinkable whispers, that he might even name her as his successor. In a world where power was measured by the sword and the wrestling grip, this was revolutionary. Unsurprisingly, the Mongol nobility found this idea as palatable as cold mutton. The throne eventually went to a male relative, but Cthulhu's legend only grew. Even Marco Polo, the original travel vlogger, wrote about the princess who fought like a tiger and could outride, outshoot, and outwrestle any man. Later generations tried to tidy up her story, painting her as love-struck or turning her into pure myth. But the truth remains, in the most male-dominated empire on Earth, Cthulhu rose to the top through strength, skill, and a refusal to accept second place. She didn't wait for permission. She simply made it impossible to ignore her. Now, let's slip through a hidden door in our museum and emerge in 15th century France, where the air is thick with incense, suspicion, and the distant rumble of cannon fire. Imagine a world where women couldn't vote, own land, or even wear pants without risking arrest. Into this world steps Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Domremy, illiterate, barely 17, and yet destined to rattle the thrones of kings. Joan didn't come armed with a noble pedigree or years of military training. What she did have were voices. She insisted that saints spoke to her, urging her to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin. To most, this sounded halfway between audacious and mad. Yet somehow, her conviction pierced through the layers of French bureaucracy and royal doubt. The clergy interrogated her for weeks, searching for a crack, but they found only a steely certainty that unnerved even the most seasoned skeptics. When Joan donned her white armor and rode to Orléans, the city was already choking under siege, its defenders ready to throw in the towel if towels had been invented. She didn't just inspire from afar. She led charges, took arrows, and turned despair into adrenaline. Against all odds, the French broke the siege. Suddenly, Joan was no longer the weird village girl with voices. She was the Maid of Orléans, the walking embodiment of divine favor and national hope. With Joan at the helm, the victories kept coming. She escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned king, fulfilling the prophecy that had set her journey in motion. But as any student of history or soap operas knows, the higher you climb, the more enemies you attract. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Her trial was a sham, with charges ranging from heresy to the truly scandalous crime of wearing male clothing. At 19, she was burned at the stake in Rouen's marketplace. Her courage in the face of death only amplified her legend. Years later, the church would clear her name, and centuries after that, canonize her as a saint. Each of these women, Boudica, Cthulhu, Joan, took the world's expectations and ground them into dust. Their stories are a reminder that rebellion isn't always about victory. Sometimes, it's about refusing to accept defeat, no matter how overwhelming the odds. They became symbols not just of resistance, but of possibility. Reminders that even the most rigid societies have cracks, where the unexpected can take root. As the echoes of hooves and battle cries fade, our gallery's next door creaks open. The torchlight falls on a new set of faces, warrior women who stood their ground, not in myth, but in the smoldering crucible of modern warfare. By the time Nakano Takeko took up her naginata, a bladed polearm favored by samurai women, Japan was changing fast. Step with me now through this gallery's flickering lantern-lit corridors, where the echoes of forgotten footsteps and the whisper of silk armor hang in the air. Our next exhibit comes to life in late 1860s Japan, a time when the samurai's world was being swept away by the tides of modernization. This is the story of Nakano Takeko, who stood, naginata in hand, where tradition met oblivion. Picture her, born in 1847, in a household where wisdom and warcraft mingled like ink on parchment. By the time she could read Confucian poetry, she was already learning the art of calligraphy and, crucially, the precision of martial movement. Her weapon of choice, the naginata, a polearm crowned with a gleaming blade, was both tool and totem. For centuries, samurai women favored it, not just for its reach, but for its symbolism. An emblem of grace entwined with lethal intent. Under her adoptive father's watchful eye, Takeko trained until her form was flawless, her strikes the equal of any man's. If there had been samurai TikTok tutorials, she would have gone viral for her technique alone. By her early 20s, Takeko was both teacher and warrior, instructing other women in the art of defense. But history, as it so often does, demanded more than drills and discipline. In 1868, the Boshin War erupted, a civil conflict tearing Japan between the old Tokugawa shogunate and the winds of imperial reform. While official edicts barred women from the battlefield, Takeko refused to watch from the sidelines. Instead, she gathered a band of women, her own impromptu battalion called the Joshitai, the Women's Army. Imagine them, clad in hakama trousers, chest plates gleaming, their banners unfurling against the smoky sky. They marched out not as spectres of a fading age, but as its final, furious defenders. At the siege of Aizu, Takeko led her Joshitai into the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. Imperial soldiers, armed with shiny new rifles, clashed with these women wielding blades sharpened by centuries of tradition. Eyewitnesses tell us that Takeko fought with a ferocity that would make a modern martial arts champion look like they were play fighting with pool noodles. Even when a bullet pierced her chest, she refused surrender. In a final act of willpower that still echoes through Japanese folklore, she asked her sister to take her head so her body would not be desecrated by the enemy. Takeko was buried at a temple in Fukushima, her beloved Naginata laid to rest by her side. Today, statues across Japan still capture her unbowed spirit, the last honor bugaisha, standing between past and future, refusing to yield either to men or to mortality itself. Now, let's slip down a different corridor, its walls still scorched by the thunder of 20th century war. Here, in the icy trenches of the Eastern Front, a new legend took aim. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death, whose name alone could make Wehrmacht soldiers drop their rifles and reconsider their career choices. Born in 1916, in what is now Ukraine, Lyudmila was competitive by nature and patriotic to the core. She was a natural marksman, which, in that time and place, was not part of any typical university orientation. When Hitler's forces invaded in 1941, Lyudmila was just 24, studying history at university. She could have kept to her books, but instead she picked up a rifle and volunteered for the Red Army. Officials, in a move that would fit right in with the 1940s HR department, suggested she try nursing. Lyudmila's response was a polite but firm, "No, thank you. I'd rather shoot Nazis." She got her wish, and then some. Deployed to the front lines at Odessa, and later Sevastopol, Lyudmila became a ghost in the snow, waiting motionless for hours, her finger poised, breath held, as she scanned for enemy officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. Her patience bordered on supernatural. Her nerves were steel. Each confirmed kill wasn't just a number, it was a message. The myth of female weakness was, in her hands, a misfire. By the time her tally reached 309, including 36 enemy snipers, she was considered too valuable to risk any longer. The Soviet command pulled her from the front and sent her on a diplomatic tour across the US, Canada, and the UK. There, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and struck up a friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her wit as much as her marksmanship. Reporters, ever eager to miss the point, peppered her with questions about her beauty routine and wardrobe. Lyudmila, deadpan as a world-weary stand-up comic, replied that she wore the uniform of her country and preferred powder for her face, gunpowder. She urged the Allies to open a second front, all while becoming an icon not just of Soviet heroism, but of the simple, stubborn fact that women could, and did, outfight the best of men. After the war, Ludmilla didn't vanish into the footnotes. She earned her degree, trained future snipers, and remained a symbol of defiance long after the last shot was fired. War left its scars, but it couldn't erase her legend. To this day, she stands as a hero in Russia and Ukraine, a reminder that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who never wanted to be called heroes at all. But let's not close the doors of this gallery just yet. For every name that has carved itself into legend, Boudica, Tomoy-Gosen, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, there are countless others whose stories have been quietly swept under the historical rug. History, as I often tell my more skeptical visitors, is rarely an impartial curator. It was mostly written by men, and when women took up arms, their deeds were often glossed over, recast as myth, or left to gather dust in the archives. Yet, the truth is unavoidable. Warrior women have stood at the heart of history, their silence enforced by the scriptwriters, not by themselves. Let's take a global detour. In 1st century Vietnam, the Trung sisters, Trung Trach and Trung Hung, Nhung, led a rebellion against Chinese domination that makes Game of Thrones look tame. These sisters, atop elephants, rallied thousands to their cause and ruled an independent state for 3 years, before overwhelming Chinese forces brought them down. Their bravery is still celebrated in Vietnam, with temples and festivals, even if Western textbooks seem to have misplaced the page. Or consider Ya Asantewaa of the Ashanti Empire, who, in 1900, led her people against the might of the British Empire. When the British demanded the sacred golden stool, a symbol of Ashanti sovereignty, Ya Asantewaa responded not with diplomacy, but with fire and steel. She rallied her troops and marched into battle, disproving any notion that leadership or courage came with the Y chromosome. Viking shield maidens, once thought mere legend, now rise from the earth in archaeological digs, buried with swords, armor, and even war horses. These were not ceremonial burials, but tributes to real warriors. In the American Southwest, Apache women like Lozan rode and fought beside their brothers, their presence felt in every skirmish and song. Across every era, in every region, women fought not just to conquer, but to defend their families, their homes, and their cultures. Some led armies. Some struck as lone figures in desperate resistance. Some wore crowns, others tilled fields. The one thread linking them all, a refusal to accept that war was the exclusive domain of men. Today, the silence is breaking. Scholars are dusting off neglected manuscripts. Filmmakers are finding inspiration in the margins, and pop culture is finally beginning to embrace the stories of these hidden warriors. Each rediscovered name is a sharp reminder that history is not just what survived the ages, it's also what was erased and is now being reclaimed. These women never asked for statues or ballads. They asked for respect. And, at long last, the world is beginning to listen. So, as we linger in this hall of echoes and unsung valor, remember, every time we reclaim a forgotten story, we redraw the map of what history really is. The gallery is always shifting, the exhibits forever incomplete. But with each new rediscovery, the picture grows richer, and the silence a little less deafening. Speaking of things that reverberate through the ages, our next stop requires a sharper ear than a warrior's, and a mind open to the unexpected. Step with me toward a chamber where the boundaries between ritual, music, and myth dissolve. Step quietly with me into the shadowy heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Imagine the dusty courtyards of Ur, where the air shimmers with incense, and the low glow of oil lamps flickers across the faces of priests and kings alike. Here, music was not something to fill the silence at a dinner party. No, in this world, a single note had the power to beckon spirits, soothe gods, and send the living on solemn journeys. The instrument that ruled this soundscape was the lyre, an ancestor to all stringed instruments, and a kind of golden passport between the worlds of mortals and the divine. Now, don't picture some basic harp you'd find in the background of a spa playlist. The Mesopotamian lyre was a jaw-dropping artifact. Imagine a work of art so lavish it could cause even a modern-day rock star to blush. Archaeologists, led by the indomitable Sir Leonard Woolley in the Roaring Twenties, uncovered one of the most famous examples in the Royal Cemetery of Ur, the bull-headed lyre. Its soundbox, shaped like a muscular bull's body, was draped in gleaming gold leaf, and its beard shimmered with lapis lazuli, a blue so intense it could hypnotize even the most jaded museum visitor. But the bull wasn't just there for a hint of masculine style. In Mesopotamia, the bull was a walking, bellowing symbol of cosmic power and fertility. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of strapping a lightning bolt to your Fender guitar. When played, either with nimble fingers or with a dainty plectrum, the lyre would ring out with a tone both haunting and resonant. It's a sound we can only guess at today, but clay tablets covered in cuneiform give us tantalizing hints. The Sumerians used a 7-note scale, not unlike the one you'd find in the opening bars of a Taylor Swift song. If Taylor happened to be serenading Inanna, goddess of love and war, instead of a stadium full of fans. These ancient tablets don't just tell us what notes to play, but hint at a whole system of music, theory, scales, and performance practice. A musical world as sophisticated as any conservatory, only with more sand and fewer metronomes. The lyre wasn't reserved for royal banquets or the background of temple bureaucracy. It was the soundtrack to sacred offerings, its strings vibrating in the smoky air as priests sang hymns to gods like Enlil and Inanna, transforming music into a living bridge between the dust of earth and the mystery of heaven. And when royalty slipped into the next world, lyres didn't gather dust in a closet. They were buried alongside their owners, meant to guide souls through the afterlife. In a way, the lyre wasn't just an instrument. It was a voice for transformation, a passport for journeys no traveler ever returned from. Musicians in Mesopotamia were not just background extras. They were revered as keepers of oral tradition, sometimes as priestesses, other times as courtly stars, each memorizing complex repertoires passed down in scribe schools. Children who showed musical promise could find themselves enrolled in schools where music was taught alongside mathematics and astrology, a kind of ancient Hogwarts for future Beyoncé-level prodigies. And today, if you wander into certain museums, you might catch a modern reconstruction of a Mesopotamian lyre being plucked. The faint, twangy echoes remind us that before Mozart, before medieval bards, before even Homeric poets, humans were already searching for beauty amid the desert winds, one note at a time. Now, as we slip across the gallery floor, the mood changes abruptly. Picture the solemn hush of the lyre, giving way to a wild, ecstatic chaos. The musical equivalent of swapping a meditation app for a heavy metal concert. We're in ancient Greece now, and the instrument at center stage is the aulos. Forget any thoughts of gentle flutes and pastoral calm. The aulos was a double-barreled reed instrument that could outblast a stadium vuvuzela. Ancient Greeks didn't see music as mere pleasure. It was ethos, a force that could shape your soul, or at least shake loose a few of your inhibitions. The aulos was constructed from 2 pipes, crafted from bone, ivory, or wood, each with its own reed and finger holes. Imagine a musician with bulging cheeks, playing both pipes at once, producing a sound so dense and penetrating that even modern bagpipes might consider it a bit much. Mastering the aulos required a trick called circular breathing, inhaling through the nose while pushing air out through the cheeks. This technique was impressive enough to inspire ancient athletes to poke fun at aulos players. Puffed faces, a sort of ancient version of gym bros mocking the band. Kids, though, ironically, both sides knew who really controlled the mood of the party. The aulos was the soundtrack of Dionysian revels, military marches, and Greek theatre. It was there in the background of tragedies and comedies, giving Sophocles and Euripides the emotional punch you might expect from a film score today. In the chaos of hoplite battle, its piercing notes kept soldiers in step, slicing through the noise and fear. And during Bacchic rituals, the aulos could drive dancers into trance states, dissolving the barriers between performer and possessed, mortal and divine. Plato, ever the philosopher with a taste for order, had a love-hate relationship with the aulos. He dismissed it as dangerously intoxicating, preferring the more orderly lyre and kithara, but he could never fully deny the aulos' raw emotional power. One moment, it could make you mourn. The next, it could whip you into a frenzy, a kind of ancient multi-effects pedal, if you will. Fragments of these ancient auloi still rest in museum cases, their forms reconstructed by modern craftspeople who bravely attempt to recapture their primal energy. Unlike the mathematically balanced lyre, the aulos wasn't about perfection. It was about ecstatic release, about stirring the blood and breaking boundaries, a musical force that could spark both celebration and chaos, often in the same breath. Let's glide east now, the gallery transforming into a tranquil scholar studio in ancient China, where incense curls upward and moonlight falls on polished wood. Here, music wasn't just performance, it was philosophy, meditation, and the art of self-cultivation. The guqin and the guzheng, two zithers that looked like cousins at a family reunion, each shaped the Chinese soul in their own way. The guqin is the elder, a venerable seven-stringed instrument with over 3,000 years of history. Its long, fretless body looks deceptively simple, but in the hands of a sage, it produces tones so subtle and quiet, they seem more like whispered secrets than music. A guqin melody is built from slides, harmonics, and plucked notes that linger in the air like raindrops on ancient tiles. Confucius himself is said to have played the guqin, believing it cultivated virtue and inner balance. In this world, mastering music wasn't about dazzling an audience. It was a path to civilization, a way for scholars to tune themselves to the harmony of heaven and earth. Playing the guqin was less rock star, more philosopher in residence. Now, contrast that with the guzheng, the guqin's younger, bolder cousin. With 16 to 21 strings, or even more in modern versions, the guzheng was designed to fill rooms with bright, cascading melodies. Its curved frame and movable bridges allowed musicians to create lush glissandos, rippling notes like waterfalls over river stones. Guzheng players wore plectra on their fingers, plucking out tunes that could mimic galloping horses, flowing rivers, or the heartbreak of star-crossed lovers. If the guzheng whispered to the soul, the guzheng sang to the crowd, whether at palace banquets, folk festivals, or military camps. It was the ultimate crowd pleaser, long before the electric guitar solo ever existed. Both instruments had their roles in ritual, storytelling, and education. The guqin often accompanied poetry readings, philosophical debates, and meditation sessions. The guzheng was there for opera, epic storytelling, and public celebrations, bringing history to life with every note. Even the players themselves reflected ancient social ideals. The guqin was usually played by male scholars, while the guzheng became associated with female performers in later dynasties. Both, however, were considered essential to a well-rounded education, woven into the Confucian vision of balanced personal development. Today, the echoes of the guqin's whispers and the guzheng's song still drift through concert halls and classrooms, carrying with them the ancient belief that music is more than sound. It's a bridge between worlds, a path to virtue, and a living memory of the soul of China. So as we leave behind these ancient realms, Mesopotamia's golden lyres, Greece's wild auloi, and China's contemplative zithers, notice how each culture heard music not just as background noise, but as a force that could stir the cosmos, shape identity, and even change fate. Next, we'll travel to lands where music carved out sacred landscapes in sand and stone. Step quietly through the next gallery and listen. If you can hear past the echo of your own footsteps, you might catch a strain of something ancient. In Egypt, music wasn't just the background hum of civilization. It was the very air itself, connecting gods and mortals, rulers and servants, the living and the not-so-living. Every stone corridor, every marketplace, every dim-lit temple chamber thrummed with sound, as if the Nile itself carried melodies along with silt and secrets. Picture a scene, a sunlit courtyard in Thebes, perfumed with lotus and bustling with life. A group of musicians, robed in linen, gather around a harp that curves like a bow drawn for battle. These early harps would have looked right at home in a modern art museum, elegant and strange, their frames stretching taller than some of the players. Fingers dance across strings, coaxing out notes as delicate as the wings of a scarab. It's no casual performance. These musicians are temple regulars, not just entertainers, but priestesses and priests, wielding music like a spell. Their melodies are thought to ease pharaohs into eternity, guiding souls across the borderless field of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife, which, if you believe the tomb murals, is basically a never-ending music festival with better snacks. Just off to the side, another musician stands ready with a sistrum, a sacred rattle, not the sort you'd hand to a bored toddler. This one is all bronze and authority, a handheld thunderstorm. With every shake, the sistrum sends a jangling shimmer through the air. The goddess Hathor, whose business card reads patron of music, motherhood and joy, is said to delight in its clamor. Temples ring with this metallic music, driving off unwelcome spirits, purifying the air, and, if you're lucky, summoning a deity or two for tea. If you've ever tried to get someone's attention at a noisy party, you'll understand the logic. The sistrum ensures the gods can't pretend not to hear you. Meanwhile, flutes, crafted from reeds, or sometimes even bone, add their breathy voices to the ensemble, weaving through crowds during processions and rituals. Their sound is light, almost teasing, like the breeze that stirs papyrus on the riverbank. Then come the double clarinets, two pipes played at once, buzzing together in a harmony that would make any modern jazz duo jealous. It's a sound both earthy and otherworldly, a musical ancestor to the aulos of Greece. Percussion is never far behind. Frame drums thud in time with the heartbeats of dancers. Castanets and hand clappers snap in the hands of festival goers. And everywhere you look, rhythm pulses like blood through the city's veins. And here's a twist for the history buffs. Professional musicians in ancient Egypt, those wielders of harps and voices, were often women. The art on tomb walls doesn't lie. You'll see them, harpists, singers, spiritual powerhouses, bearing titles like Chantress of Amun and Musician of Isis. These weren't just background singers, they were guardians of cosmic order, their music marking transitions between life and death, between the mundane and the sacred. Their role went well beyond entertainment. Imagine a modern pop diva, but with the added responsibility of ensuring the sun rises on schedule. No pressure. Frustratingly for musicologists, the Egyptians didn't leave us a handy playlist. Their musical notation, if it ever existed, is as elusive as the lost chord. Instead, we have painted scenes, carved reliefs, and the instruments themselves, buried with their owners, meant to be played again in paradise. To these ancient people, music was not a hobby. It was the blueprint of the universe, a force binding everything together. Even in death, you'd better pack your harp. Eternity is a long time without a decent soundtrack. Now, let's leave the Nile's banks and travel deep into the vast green tapestry of Africa, where the story of music takes on a new rhythm, one that you don't just hear, but feel in your bones. Long before anyone thought to chisel words in stone, African cultures spoke with sound. Drums became the continent's first wireless communication system, and honestly, they put your group chat to shame. Picture a village clearing at dusk. The air vibrates with the calls of insects and, most importantly, with the insistent storytelling beat of drums. In West Africa, the talking drum reigns supreme. It's shaped like an hourglass and strung with taut leather cords. A master drummer, stick in hand, squeezes and strikes, coaxing the drum to mimic the rise and fall of spoken language. Entire conversations, gossip, warnings, royal decrees can ripple from one village to the next, faster than you can say, reply all. Births, deaths, celebrations and emergencies are all announced in this polyphonic code. It's as if every drummer holds a direct line to the community's collective memory, and, if you believe the legends, to the spirits themselves. But African drums weren't just for keeping people in the know. They were, and still are, sacred instruments. In the ancient kingdoms of Kush and Nubia, drumming summoned ancestors and deities with each resounding thud. In Ifa and Benin, drums honored kings and gods during elaborate court rituals, marking the passage of time, the shifting of power, the very heartbeat of the land. Initiation ceremonies, healing rites, funerals, each event had its own rhythm, its own carefully crafted pattern. To play a sacred drum was to stir the world beyond the veil, to invite invisible forces into the circle. African drums came in a dizzying variety. There's the djembe, the dundan, the bugarabu, and the kidi, to name just a few. Each is carved from a single log, hollowed with reverence, stretched tight with animal hide. The tuning is meticulous, the construction a sacred act, often handed down through generations. During the making of a drum, there are rituals for every step, measuring, shaping, binding, tuning. It's less like building an instrument, and more like summoning a new member of the village. And don't forget the supporting cast, rattles, bells, shakers, thumb pianos, all layering their voices into a complex, polyrhythmic tapestry that Western ears would only begin to decipher centuries later. In Africa, music is never just something you listen to. It's something you live. To hear a drum is to move, to dance, to breathe, to sweat, to remember. The drummer isn't a distant performer, but a conduit, channeling ancestral energy, communal spirit, and the memory of generations. The beat travels far beyond its birthplace, riding the currents of the trans-Saharan trade, floating down the Nile, and, tragically, crossing the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships. The rhythms survive in Brazil's samba, the Caribbean's calypso, and the syncopated heart of jazz. But their roots remain in Africa, where drumming is not a pastime, but a declaration. We are here. We remember. We endure. Now, if you're ready for a change of altitude, let's ascend to the Andean highlands, where the air grows thin and every sound seems to hang in the sky a little longer. Here, music rides on wind, not on strings or skins. In the stone cities and terraced fields of ancient Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the soundtrack was woven from breath and bamboo. The most iconic instrument, the panpipe, or siku, a bundle of reeds or canes, each cut to a different length and bound together in orderly rows. Don't be fooled by the simplicity. Each tube plays a single note, but the magic comes when two players alternate melodies, weaving their notes together in a musical conversation. This technique, known as hocketing, isn't just clever. It's a sonic reflection of Andean philosophy, duality, balance, cooperation. If you've ever tried to play a duet with someone using only one hand each, you'll appreciate the level of teamwork involved here. The resulting harmony floats across the mountains, haunting and bright, as if the wind itself has something to say. Flutes, too, abound in the Andes. Some are small enough to wear as pendants, others so large they rumble like distant thunder. Often they're carved in the shapes of birds, snakes, or mythical beings, blurring the line between sound and spirit. These instruments weren't mere entertainment. They were sacred tools, used to summon rain, bless crops, honor the sun, and call on ancestors. And now for something delightfully odd, the whistling vessels of the Moshe civilization, which might be the world's earliest musical water bottles. Pour liquid into one, and internal chambers force air out a whistle, creating eerie tones that seem to come from nowhere. It's musical pottery at its finest, a collaboration of water, breath, and play, all in the service of ritual. Archaeologists can only guess at the ceremonies these vessels accompanied, but it's safe to say you wouldn't want to show up without one. In Inca society, music threaded through every moment of life, from the first wail of a newborn to the last song at a funeral, from the march of soldiers to the planting of seeds. Every task had its melody. Musicians played for Inti, the sun god, and Pachamama, the earth mother, offering their breath as an act of devotion. Even warfare was choreographed with flutes, transforming battle into ritual, a sort of high-altitude halftime show. Though Spanish conquerors tried their best to silence these traditions, the echoes of Andean music never fully faded. Today, you can still hear those flutes and panpipes in the high villages of Peru and Bolivia, ancient voices that refuse to be forgotten. Their song floats above stone and sky, a reminder that music is both practical technology and mystical force, an invisible thread binding past to present. So as we step from this gallery of sacred soundscapes, the air still humming with ancient resonance, let's travel onward. Music, as we've seen, has always shaped worlds in ways both cosmic and intimate. And nowhere is this more true than in the next stage of our journey, where engineering, mathematics, and the search for harmony reach new heights. In ancient India, music was more than a performance. Step with me now into a chamber where the air hums with unseen vibrations, where ancient rulers and wandering mystics share a stage, and where the very fabric of reality seems to shimmer with invisible sound waves. Here, deep within the museum's labyrinth, I invite you to listen, not just with your ears, but with the marrow of your bones, to the saga of cosmic engineering, as imagined by the musicians of ancient India and Mesoamerica. This is not music for background noise or elevator rides. This is music that was meant to set the universe in motion. In the beginning, at least according to Hindu philosophy, everything started with a sound. Not a catchy pop hook or the jingle from a shampoo commercial, but the primal vibration, OM. Imagine, if you will, the universe itself unfurling from a single, resonant hum, as if reality were the ultimate surround sound system. In this world, music wasn't just entertainment or a skill to impress at parties. It was the blueprint of existence. The earliest Indian texts, the Vedas, already ancient by 1500 BCE, are laced with hymns called Saman chants. Now, these weren't just poems to be read in a monotone. No, they were sung, with melodies precisely prescribed to nudge the soul into alignment with the divine. Picture a priest in flowing robes, voice rising and falling like a cosmic tide, each note chosen as carefully as a master chef, selecting the right spice. And the priests themselves, the Brahmins, were not just keepers of ritual flame or philosophers in impressive headgear. They were trained like vocal athletes, schooled in the art of pitch, cadence, and enunciation, because one wrong note, so the theory went, could derail the entire ritual. Imagine the pressure. One flat note, and you've accidentally summoned a rainstorm instead of enlightenment. The instruments of Vedic and post-Vedic India were more than tools. They were talismans, portals, and sometimes outright celebrities in their own right. Take the veena, a plucked string instrument with a bulbous resonant chord that could make even the most somber sage tap his foot. The veena wasn't just a source of melody. It was a symbol of wisdom and learning, forever linked with Saraswati, the goddess holding court over knowledge and the arts. Its strings, so the ancients believed, echoed the vibrations of the cosmos itself. Every note was a chance to brush against universal truth, to play a duet with the stars. And then there's the bansuri, the bamboo flute, which has a resume that would make any modern influencer jealous. Not only did it charm humans, but, according to legend, it could also captivate animals and gods. Lord Krishna, the blue-skinned deity of love and divine mischief, was rarely depicted without his trusty flute. The sound of the bansuri, people believed, could pierce the veil of illusion, Maya, and transport listeners to higher realms, which is a lot more impressive than any noise-cancelling headphones on the market today. Percussion, too, was elevated to an art of cosmic consequence. The mridangam and tabla weren't just keeping time. Their rhythms mirrored the patterns of breath, heartbeats, and the great cycles of the cosmos. The rhythmic patterns, or talas, could be dizzyingly complex, some looping in perfect symmetry, others veering into glorious asymmetry, all mapped to the emotional spectrum and the turning of the day. This was music as math, as meditation, and as mood lighting for the soul, all rolled into one. And let's not forget rasa theory, the notion that music's true role was to stir up specific emotional flavors. Love, heroism, serenity, sorrow. Each was a dish to be served, and the raga, the melodic frame, was the recipe. Even in antiquity, Indian musicians crafted these ragas not just to entertain, but to guide meditation, heal, and transform. What's perhaps most extraordinary is that, unlike so many ancient arts swallowed by time, India's musical tradition hasn't just survived. It's grown, adapted, and continued to echo that earliest belief, that to make music is to touch something divine. Cross the world now, past oceans and centuries, and arrive in the heart of Mesoamerica, where the air pulses with a very different, but equally sacred, energy. From the immense pyramids of Teotihuacan to the ceremonial plazas of the Maya and Aztec empires, music was not merely background ambience. It was power itself, a means to commune with gods, sanctify blood offerings, summon rain, and, on occasion, terrify your enemies into reconsidering their life choices. In Mesoamerica, music was ritual technology. It was the invisible thread that stitched together the living, the dead, and the divine. Drums were the anchors of this sonic world. The most iconic was the huhuetl, a towering, single-headed drum carved from a hollowed tree trunk and played with bare hands. Covered in animal skins and adorned with sacred images and glyphs, the huhuetl didn't just provide rhythm. Its deep, resonant thud was said to echo through the stone courtyards, like the heartbeat of the gods themselves. During festivals, warfare, or sacrifices, its sound could make your very bones vibrate. Then there's the teponasli, a slit drum carved from wood, played with rubber-tipped mallets. Its surface was shaped into two tongues, each producing a different pitch when struck. The teponazli could do more than just keep time. It could, in the hands of a master, sing the names of deities, or even mimic the rhythms of fate. In Nahuatl, the Aztec language, people said the teponazli could speak, and sometimes those words were not meant for mortal ears. Wind instruments, too, filled the air with magic and menace. Flutes crafted from bone, clay, or reed were common, often shaped into the likeness of animals or gods. Some were so cunningly made that they could mimic the calls of birds, the growls of jaguars, or, in the case of the infamous Aztec death whistle, the very sound of a human scream. Shaped like a skull and blown like a flute, the death whistle produces a shriek so blood-chilling that even modern listeners, safely ensconced on their sofas, might feel the urge to check if the doors are locked. Some scholars believe it was used to strike terror into enemies during war, or to open portals to the spirit world in sacrificial rites. Either way, it's not the sort of thing you'd want as your morning alarm. Music in Mesoamerica marked every major moment: births, coming-of-age ceremonies, warfare, the cycles of planting and harvest, and, of course, death. musicians and dancers trained in special schools, performing not just for the crowds, but for the gods themselves. Certain instruments were so sacred that only nobles or priests could play them, and a single wrong note might be considered a spiritual misstep of cosmic proportions. Even sacrificial ceremonies, central to Aztec religion, unfolded to a musical score. Drums thundered, flutes wailed, and great conch shells roared as hearts were offered to the sun. This music didn't comfort, it electrified. It guided souls, nourished gods, and kept the cosmic machinery humming. In Mesoamerica, music wasn't a pleasant backdrop. It was the ceremony itself, a force meant to transform, not entertain. And yet, despite the rise and fall of empires and the fading of old gods, the music never truly died. Its echoes linger, sometimes in rituals, sometimes in the design of modern instruments, and sometimes simply in the way a melody can make the hairs on your arms stand up. Ancient music was never meant to be frozen on a page or tucked away in a dusty archive. It was kept alive through hands, voices, and memories, a living tradition passed along from heart to heart. Take a look at the Chinese guqin or the Indian veena. These aren't just relics under glass. They're instruments still played today, using techniques that have survived for thousands of years. When a performer plucks a string or draws a bow, they're not just recreating notes from a lost age. They're channeling centuries of philosophy, emotion, and meditation. In a single phrase, you might hear the same longing or exaltation once felt by an emperor or a wandering sage. Across Africa, the drums still speak. The syncopated rhythms of the djembe, the call and response chants, and the interplay of dance all reach back to traditions older than any map or written word. In the Americas, the haunting breath of the Andean siku, or the thunder of powwow drums among indigenous nations, carries forward ancestral voices. Some instruments are direct descendants, others are bold reinventions, but the roots always run deep. Even in the digital cacophony of today, you can still hear ancient echoes. The seven-note scale of Mesopotamia quietly underpins much of modern harmony. The modes and intervals of Greek music theory shaped early Christian chant, which eventually blossomed into classical music. The lyre became the lute gave birth to the guitar. The double reed aulos inspired the oboe and bassoon. History is one long remix, and the beat never really stops. But perhaps the most persistent legacy is the very purpose of music itself. In ancient times, music was not created to sell out stadiums or climb the charts. It was ritual, healing, and transformation. It marked every threshold, birth and death, planting and reaping, love and war. It meant something, and it still does. Today, music remains our one true universal language. It can move us to tears without a single word, create community without a single wall. In a world flooded with noise, the ancient lesson remains. Sound can be sacred, rhythm can be memory, and melody is a thread that binds us across centuries. Whether whispered from a guqin, thundered on a war drum, or breathed through a clay flute, the songs of our ancestors still echo in the present. All we have to do is listen, and who knows what worlds might open up when we do.